already have 2 participants here as well. It's good. I'm gonna just disconnect. I think I got it from Bureau. The Bureau Wi-Fi. So that's good. I just entered mine. And as people are connecting, I'm just gonna mute my phone for now, and we're going to address.
I try to retire, but they won't let me. Call me up.
Perfect.
It'll work out.
Yeah, in the waiting room.
Once this mess is over, guys like you are going to be the
you will
hottest
not be able to.
commodities. You will.
Hello, welcome. Oh yeah, this is it. Okay, perfect. This is working. Hello, welcome, please. Have a seat.
Have some coffee as well as you feel like
It's working pretty well, the internet connection, usually, right? That's perfect. There's just connect the other side down. Vladimir is going to be basic Zoom. We just turned it to you. We have put it in front of you, and that's it. Okay, once we have the welcoming box.
this is fine if I record as well.
Excellent. Thank you. Yes. Cool. You know how to convert that directly into
No, I don't
No, my work came journalist, so and that's
I never left. I left Moscow and came right here.
transcribing.
I never left, except when they sent me back to Moscow.
Hours and then you know that you're gonna spend like 3
It's horrible. Exactly. Exactly. Hello, Gil. Hello, hello. Can you hear me? Hello. Thank you for joining. Pleasure to see you. You're muted, but
I need to go back to Moscow for 2 weeks.
this is it. Yeah, most people will be on Zoom.
But I'd end
That's
up, you know.
the bane of mixed formats. How are you? Doing good? Yeah. We're gonna have most of the people are gonna be on Zoom, so you won't see them, but I'll see them and I'll tell you how many and who, and then we're gonna also start by saying hi to them as well, and then having kind of a round of the table for you guys will be our audio, and then believe me, there is not too much video here either. So and then to kind of see who's around, and for those participants who can say who they are and where they are. Okay, I'm gonna try to make it so that you can see Vladimir, the function which shows everything. Yeah, here we go. View gallery. Here we go. This way. Hello, Christian. How are you? I don't know if you can unmute your phone, your microphone. Welcome. Good to see you. Everybody's muted.
Yeah, that's fine, no problem.
Hello, hello. It's a pity you couldn't make it in person because you are in Paris. It's we would have loved to see you here, but okay, we still accept Christian. Next time.
Okay, next time.
And we'll miss you for the afterwards. Hello, Madalena. How are you doing?
Hi, Anastasia. I also was supposed to be in presence today. I'm sorry I couldn't make it.
You are also in Paris? I'll never forget.
Yeah, I know. But I've been registered and I was super motivated. I took my afternoon off, and then some mess happened at home, and I had to stay home.
You're about to tell us that you are not working this afternoon, having said that you'll be attending a conference.
Yes, and in the end I couldn't make it, and I'm super pissed off.
Already. Well, I see JF Couton. Maybe you can introduce yourself and tell us who you are and where you are from. You are joining from. If you are in Paris, it's okay. It's bad. We hate you for that, but it's okay. Can you tell us just a couple of words? JF Couton. If you're not in Paris, you're forgiven. And if you cannot speak because you're in office, you're also forgiven. And unfortunately, I have a new function which requires me to admit people as they show up. So I'm sorry for having you guys wait in the waiting room. I see Dmitro Glaskov. Dmitro, maybe you can introduce yourself, tell us where you're coming from and which company you represent. If you can speak, of course. Vadim Urasov. Vadim, hello, welcome. Hello. And here also we start having, as we're advancing, people joining. We're gonna wait for maybe 5 more minutes to have some more people join. Then we're gonna have a tour de table or just a round of introductions. Madame Labouktine, bienvenue. Merci beaucoup d'être venue, d'être avec nous. J'espère que vous entendez bien. And who did I not say hi to from the so far joined? Okay, we have Pierre Rondeau joining us, Anushka Galland. Anushka, hello, very good to see you. If you can speak, please introduce yourself. We have very shy participants this time. Usually we start with a quick around the table, but today it's a bit shy, but they are logging in. So far we are 12 on Zoom. We are about 10 in the room here physically. Maybe we'll start with the room as people are joining on Zoom, and I'm sorry if I'm going to be just distracted because I have to now admit people for some reason. This is a new function on the Zoom. They have updated the account apparently today. But we're going to start with the quick round maybe of introductions. I think, Vladimir, you're going to be lost because I'll introduce you. Sorry, yeah, I printed out the whole page about you. So that's going to be like that. But maybe we'll start from here with Paulius, who's kindly actually organized the whole hosting today. Please, Paulius.
Hi, everyone. So my name is Paulius, and I'm quite fresh member of Eastern Circles. I think I joined in May. I was immediately fascinated by all the insights on energy and especially in the current geopolitical context, especially since Pietra and myself and other colleagues will be joining. We're working in a strategic advisory firm, Project Associates, and a lot of our work is related to energy subjects. This is a fascinating opportunity for us to be part of. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Please.
Hi, I'm Pietra. I'm just essentially going to echo what Paul has just said. I've seen him organise this from a little bit from afar and decided to join to learn more about Eastern Circles and some of the insight that we might be getting today. Very happy to be here.
Thank you so much.
Hi, I'm Nathan. I'm a PhD student at UCL and I'm interested in energy security, particularly the Visegrad group. So I decided why not to come here and see what it's saying.
Thank you, Nathan. Please.
Hi, I'm Moaz. I'm studying Paris Saclay on political science, and I want to be a researcher on question about related to oil and energy resources. So that's why I'm here.
And which school in Paris Saclay? Or is it the big university which is now basically merged? Yeah, this is it. Okay, thank you.
Well, I'm
Please
Friedrich Kafar, a former German diplomat, the father of Nord Stream 1.
Oh dear, oh dear. What are we going to do to you today?
I had to sort out the legal and international problems of Nord Stream 1. So the tracé of this pipeline is the tracé Catois, because I went around Poland and the Baltic states.
Oh dear, oh dear. Well,
But
in
the
a big...
decision was taken by a certain Schröder. And he was in conflict with the Green ministers at that time, and that he didn't enforce that.
I have a feeling that we're going to have a fascinating discussion and that we have a well-informed...
Otherwise, I'm a diplomat and specialist on international law, all and everything you can imagine. And most of that you can't imagine.
That's precisely why
And
the
that's
international
not
law.
just the point of gas pipelines and other things. And my main concern when I did this pipeline Nord Stream 1 was that with Norway, my predecessor had arranged the two pipelines from Norway. And for one reason or the other, no one in the press or elsewhere is talking about the fact that Germany has two pipelines from 25 years ago with Norway. And Germany was the only country who could switch from one side to the other. Of course, Norway is a country which is selling always good at high price.
Thank you very much. I think that we're going to maybe talk about those pipelines more during the year, because I think they're going to be very important, but especially as well today. It's going to be, we're going to have a section on the consequences of the sanctions also for the European Union and not just for Russia, so to say the reverse sanctions. Please go ahead. For those who are joining us online, we are starting with a quick round of introductions. I'm going to just show you the room, that you know that you're not alone here online, that there are also live people in the room, and to encourage you to come next time, because especially for those of you who are in Paris, you're pardoned this time, but not next time. Please go ahead.
Hello, my name is Laura. I have recently joined the embassy of Lithuania here, and I'm covering all political issues. So I'm trying to figure out what is happening here in this big city.
So it's Irina who sent you to us today. Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. Good, happy to see you. Please.
I'm going to make it 3 for the diplomatic corner. My name is Wolfgang Schulz. I'm with the German embassy here in Paris. Next door. I'm in the economic section, dealing with a focus on energy, climate, and environment questions. Recently, it's only been energy. So very interested in what's being presented today. Thanks for the invitation.
Thank you so much for coming. Yeah, please.
Hello, everybody. I'm Alexei Lopov. I'm currently doing consulting with power engineering, and I used to work for Rosatom until the war started. So
we have 2 bad guys in the room today. We can throw stones
I
at.
don't think I'm a bad guy.
One from Germany, one from Russia. No. Thank you very much, Alexei. Please.
My name is Craig Kapitas. I am the exiled midfielder from Moscow Lokomotiv and former correspondent in Moscow for many years for the Wall Street Journal. I'm currently a columnist at the Daily Beast.
Thank you very much, Craig. And finally, to our guest, Vladimir, would you allow me to introduce yourself, or do you prefer to do it better for yourself?
I will say a couple of words. My name is Vladimir Milov. I am from Russia, but I lived for the past year and a half in Lithuania. Otherwise, if I haven't left Russia, I would be in jail by now. I'm officially on the Russian Interior Ministry wanted list.
That's what we were wondering actually with Craig just before.
I'm a frequent visitor to European capitals, but haven't been to Paris recently, and I'm obviously happy to join you. We met with Anastasia and Botislava at the Globsec forum, and she said, whenever you're in Paris, drop by. So I did, and I'm actually happy to have this informal chat about whatever is going on. There's a lot to focus on, and energy, of course, I think will be one of the topics. I used to have a long career in the energy sector, working for 6 years in the Russian government, regulating this sphere 25 years ago. And obviously, I'm into politics now. I'm a major international affairs representative of Alexei Navalny. So this is the primary reason why I'm in Paris. I'm meeting with the foreign ministry, senators, political parties to discuss all things Russia and Russia politics. But also, we'll be happy to touch on a broad range of topics.
And that's the primary reason you also wanted in Russia.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, there are many reasons why I wanted from Russia. Actually, the formal legal reason why I'm wanted is a lawsuit from Prigozhin.
What an honor.
Prigozhin, the infamous Putin's chef, he was very offended by some of my remarks I made on the air on Navalny Live YouTube channel about him. So he's running around Russia trying to chase me and put me in jail for just saying those things. But I'm continuing. So we have an interesting showdown with him.
Good for
Vendetta,
you. Yeah. My goodness, and
Yeah.
of course everybody remembers. We're not gonna go into just the question for you, real quick, Ben.
Yeah.
Shall we stop the recording?
No, please. I mean, it's all on record.
It's all on record. Okay, perfect, good. Because if we shall, we can. It's okay. Good, very good. And we have. Please go ahead.
I have just a small question. I know since 1989, the 30th of November, a certain Andrei Kharchov, and within the Paris community, how he is considered, on which side and how.
I think maybe we'll leave the questions maybe for the unofficial discussion, but now maybe we're just going to like switch on to the energy topics. I'm just checking that nobody else is in the waiting room, which is a new kind of function which has just been added. And we have 2 more people joined us since. Please introduce yourself and tell us where you're from, because we just finished the round of introduction.
It's maybe difficult for me to speak English quickly.
It doesn't matter. Speak slowly.
I can say a few more en Russian and en français pour les autres. Je suis Alexandre Chusky, ministre conseiller par intérim à l'ambassade d'Ukraine. Enchanté. Временная средний посланник посольства Украины во Франции. И очень приятно здесь быть и послушать.
Спасибо, что пришли.
And Gabriel, please.
And Gabriel Pavlis, I'm the co-founder of Eastern Circles, and I'm really pleased to be here with you today and to take part to this discussion.
Thanks everybody for joining, and we can maybe switch to the quick introduction just of the topic. And to introduce myself, I'm Anastasia Shapashkina. For those who don't know me, I'm the founder, co-founder and president of Eastern Circles. Eastern Circles, a French think tank which works on the past, the present, and the future of the post-Soviet region. We are focused on energy and security topics. And today, of course, these are the topics which are in the heart of the discussion. We thought about this cycle of the energy diplomacy conference series, and this is the second cycle, the second series we're doing. Last year, first series was last year. Every month we're doing a conference on energy, analyzing the important topics in the field, in the region. Of course, I thought, okay, there are many conferences that are going on right now, but there are some questions which I haven't seen being addressed either in depth or being addressed fast enough, since it's changing so fast. And the situation, for example, today at the middle of September is very different from what it was in April. And today, basically, what we wanted to discuss is about, of course, the impact of the sanctions, and from different angles. The sanctions started as the reaction of the so-called United West to the military aggression in Ukraine. They follow the economic sanctions imposed on Russia since 2014, after the annexation of the Crimea and the incursion in the East. And they are supposed to be this, well, President Biden has expressed it, a nuclear weapon, so to say, of the West against Russia. The new sanctions restricted the import of Russian oil, prohibited new investment in energy projects, and made doing business in Russia very difficult, provoking an exodus of about 1,000 Western companies, including a lot of the majors in the energy sector. The Shell, BP, and Exxon would be some of the examples. And we have, for those who are online, also a nice sound accompanying this conference, which we specifically said DJ Construction, which is joining us right now. Yet also at the same time, and the sanctions were meant, of course, to cripple the Russian economy. However, they happened also at the time of the peak demand for energy. The oil prices, gas prices went through the roof. And what the European Union surprisingly hasn't really talked about too much was the impact that the sanctions can actually have on themselves, in the sense that spurring Russia to just cut the deliveries of gas to the European Union itself any moment. That realization took some time. That realization especially happened in June for me. The realization that the sanctions toward Russia eventually were just kind of the time in the waiting for Russia to take the sanctions the other way. And today we are finding ourselves in a situation when the oil sanctions are imperfect. We know that of 101 ways of going around the oil sanctions, they have had exceptions, numerous exceptions from the offset. The deadline has been prolonged for the oil sanctions. There are countries like Kazakhstan where we hear a lot of the oil is just being resold, they're just being used as hubs. There are countries, which oil is mixed with Russian oil, then gets relabeled and then resold. On gas, we understand that, of course, the European Union calculation has been that by October to fill up as much storage as possible, and then the sanctions hopefully are going to kick in the miscalculation was that Russia can cut off gas, which they've done on several directions, not all of it, until October, and that would leave a lot of the storage empty, which is now the situation, and the new contracts are not going to be yet have enough time to be set in place, which is what we're observing. Also, of course, there were bets on Venezuela and Iran, for example. People were wondering whether they were going to come into play, and we are going to have more supply coming into the markets, and that hasn't happened. While the traditional big gas exporters, for example, if you're talking about gas, and that's going to be Qatar and the US, they could increase or their supply only to a certain extent, and of course that also means skyrocketing energy prices. So for us, we're going to be several kind of angles to look at this. First is, once the sanctions were designed, maybe we'll start with very broadly from the impact of sanctions, how you perceive it on Russia. Then we're going to go into the vacuum, to analyze the vacuum left by those big Western energy companies who left Russia, and to think to talk about who has filled that space. There was a lot of expectations that the Chinese are going to fill that space, and we're not sure that exactly happened. Maybe the Indians, the Turks, we hear that, but also of course, the Russian local players. Basically, who has benefited the most of the exodus of Western investors into the Russian energy. We're then going to continue with to just have a look and discussion about those energy companies which have remained. And we know several which are very important. Total, Technip have remained in Russia despite sanctions. What is their life like? And is it just doable to ignore sanctions, to do nothing? And not being Turkey and still being able to do that. And we're going to also look at what has happened with the Russian those volumes of oil and gas which aren't able to be sold right now as a result of sanctions, since we know that the pipelines aren't exactly connecting the same fields toward Asia, the same fields toward Europe, and we want to see what's happening to the hopefully excess production in Russia, and what are the short-term, mid-term, and long-term perspectives. And finally then to look at the European crisis and the possibilities. If you're okay, we're going to proceed within this structure, and we're going to proceed with a few questions and answers kind of format for the first hour. Paulus, can I count on you for checking the time, because I may not be so good at the time. And maybe just the first question. So Vladimir, the sanctions were designed, in the words of the European Council, to weaken Russia's economic base, depriving it of critical technologies and markets, and significantly curtailing its ability to wage war. As of September, has this happened?
Well, I'm not sure it makes a lot of sense to actually narrow down the impact of sanctions to just one or two single goals. I think politicians and observers are doing a huge mistake by getting engaged in this sort of exercise. Oh, it's been 5 minutes, but Putin still hasn't stopped the war, meaning that sanctions are either not working or are working on a limited scale. I strongly encourage a serious, in-depth discussion on the topic against this headline mentality. Like, the war is still going on, meaning sanctions are not working. Like, you remember this famous debate between Dr. Watson and Sherlock Holmes, whether it is the Earth which rotates around the sun or vice versa. And Sherlock Holmes said, "My eyes tell me that it's the sun that is rotating." So we really need to study the subject a little bit deeper. For those of you who read this DJ Construction, I think he's either moving because he was playing this morning near my hotel, or that is the most fashionable kind of music in the city of Paris these days. Which is actually good, which means that if construction is going on, that's good for the economy.
Is it the KGB which is following you around Paris, trying to obstruct your speeches?
I try to be on the optimistic side of things. KGB is, by definition, always there, but this sound really gives a lot of optimism about the economy. So back to sanctions. I would advise to read my piece, which I published at Globsec website, globsec.org. You can just type Milov in search and easily find it. So there was like an in-depth look of structural impact of sanctions on different sectors and areas of the Russian economy. There will be a bigger piece coming, I think, by the end of November at the Wilfred Martens Center for European Studies in Brussels, also by myself. the impact is devastating to say the least. I was part of a major Russian economic transformation that we have undergone in the past 30 years. And as a matter of fact, what happens is we're back to Stone Age. If you want sort of a catchy headline type of characteristic of what is happening, just take a look at the number of decline of imports of smartphones, which is replaced by push button phones. So next step, typewriters, pagers. This kind of technological degradation, I mean, it will not necessarily have a catastrophic impact on everything. Life goes on, right? But Russia is being very, very rapidly detached from modern age, modern markets, modern technologies, logistics, and so on. And if you look at one reason to judge that sanctions have a very serious and profound impact is that the Russian government has been very quick in hiding the vital statistics. They wouldn't have if things were okay. The fact that they're hiding vital statistics means it's pretty goddamn far from okay, sorry to say, quoting Tarantino movie, you know. So actually, if you look at the remaining statistics, what you see, I would advise one indicator which says it all, which I think clearly reflects the level of economic activity. The non-oil and gas revenue of the federal budget, which means all the taxes collected from anything else except oil and gas industries. Minus 29% year on year in July, minus 14% in August. That is, it was like minus 16 in June or something like that. I have a graph, can share it with you. If the enterprises cannot, and if you really look at what happened to Russian economy in the past 20 years, the most sensitive area for enterprises were their relations with the tax inspection. I mean, you blink, you get an extra bill for billions and billions of rubles just for some delayed payment and so on. Means that this, to me, it looks like this is the last thing in the current Russian environment that businesses will do, you know, defer tax payments and allow tax inspection to sort of put more pressure on you. If they are really not paying taxes to that extent,
it means they have nothing to pay with.
They're really in trouble. They're really in trouble. So this is one area to look at. Another Russian statistics agency, Rosstat, still publishes a very detailed breakdown of industrial output, sector by sector, on a monthly basis. So you can see, like, the formula is very simple. Everything, like, more or less complex, cars, you know, locomotives, rail coaches, engines, internal combustion engines, electric engines, all sort of complex equipment. It's down, you know, from 50 to 80% year on year. Right? So stuff that is up is primitive, which is some basic agricultural production to substitute the imports and clothing and so on. Stuff that is more complex, that depends on technologies, on imported component parts, is pretty much down. Computer production, whatever, it's very, very significantly down. So
two quick follow-up questions of that. And I know this is uncomparable, but since 2014, Russia has been bragging that they've been always thinking and getting ready for the sanctions, and thus there are substitutes. But also, but that means not only home-produced substitutes, but maybe imported substitutes. And there was big hope that, for example, China is going to step in on anything that's engineering in oil and gas. For example, Chinese engineers, have already developed their own expertise. It's not as good, as far-fetched as the Western, but however. And second, just as you're talking about statistics, and this is very crucial. It's something that is truly, I think, super important. Is looking back to October last year, there was an FSB law which was passed. It was very long, 65-page document listing all different types of information that are going to be secret now, related to technology, production, technology, description, anything that relates to any technology which can be double use or be used for the military, any scientific information. And then since, of course, it's not me who's going to tell you about all the number of prominent scientists who are in prison for even speaking at a conference about their own scientific area about which they've spoken their whole lives. How reliable are the statistics? So the substitutes and the statistics. Has anybody risking, kind of fill in the substitutes and to sell to Russia? And when I'm saying this, also, of course, I'm thinking about within the war context, about the recent news that we saw Russia is purchasing, for example, rockets from North Korea. Last time we checked, that North Korea isn't producing anything really important. So we're thinking maybe that's China, basically selling to Russia the rockets. And if they're selling rockets, maybe they can sell other stuff.
There's also this generalized and often quite primitive talk about substitution, because even if you look at the Chinese economy and Chinese manufacturing industry, China was never actually setting a goal of becoming a total autarky, like completely independent from outside components, technologies, and so on. It's pretty much integrated. So going a little bit further, if you introduce that type of sanctions that are currently imposed against Russia, against China, their manufacturing industry would collapse. The thing is that the dependence on critical technologies, which are not available everything else, is the crucial. You can substitute 90% of the components, but the key is the remaining 10. The key for actually achieving your goals of creating some sort of production enterprise or building some technology chain or so whatever, like I can give you an example. For instance, Novatek is pursuing this Arctic LNG 2 project. Gazprom was mulling Baltic LNG together with Rothenberg and Ust-Luga. Right now, they can substitute most of the components with stuff produced in China. But there are some technologies which are missing, both in Russia and in China, like heat exchangers, for instance, which have been supplied by American Air Products or German Linde. They have withdrawn, they will not supply heat exchangers. This just one thing has a potential to effectively stop both of these projects, despite the fact that like 98 of other component parts will be supplied from anywhere else. So it's not a question of substitution in general, it's a question of critical technologies. And many of the manufacturing industries are very much dependent on those. Most of them are irreplaceable. You don't find them in China, or you might find a replacement, but it greatly reduces performance, productivity, quality. Okay, you build something, but you will spend a hell of a lot of time repairing it all the time. This was also the problem of Soviet automotive industry. People spend more time, repairing your car than riding it.
And we heard exactly that now the Russian automotive industry is going back to canceling the airbags, canceling.
So what happens is not like a collapse or catastrophe that many people wrongly expect, but a degradation. Going backwards in terms of living standards, technologies, and so on. That will have a great impact on Russia's future, pushing us onto the periphery. Economy-wise, I have to say, the correlation is very clear. All these complex manufacturing industries are very job-intensive. As a matter of fact, they're most job-intensive. Machine building is about 40% of all jobs in manufacturing industries. For instance, food industry is just a fraction, just several percentage points. Machine building is 40%. Mineral extractive industries altogether, oil, gas, iron ore, and all of the stuff that we produce from the ground is less than 2 million jobs in Russia, which is like next to nothing. Most jobs are generated by the service industry and the manufacturing industries. Altogether, this is, I think, over 30 million jobs compared to less than 1.7 million in extractive industries. Meaning that this is actually what, if those of you who speak Russian can see my recent video with Michael Nucky on YouTube, when we actually quote Putin from his recent speech given about a week ago, that, he says, unemployment is at historic lows, but the number of employed who are in danger of being fired and losing their jobs is dangerously growing. Right now, according to Rosstat, 4.5 million people are currently in this transitional status, like we have partial working week, vacation without payment of salary. That's about 3 million out of the 4.5. And how простой is it? What's the word for простой? Don't remember. There was a term.
It's like mothballing of
Yes,
the plants,
yes.
and then the people are just left on suspended.
Yeah,
Their contract is suspended, but not
suspended. So suspended, I think, is the word. So like 4.5 million people. That's 13% of the active workforce is currently in this idle status. That is related to collapse of these manufacturing industries. And the government officials, yeah, unwillingly, but they recognize that there will be growth in unemployment and there will be no replacement. Because in the areas where we, as a matter of fact, can import substitute, like producing chicken, right? They don't offer high-skilled labor and good salaries. So there will be definitely loss of living standard. Another thing, for political reason, Putin and his government have opted for this insane artificial strengthening of the ruble. That is extremely hurting the remaining export industries, like steel makers are in deep trouble. The official figures that you can find in the Russian media now is that steel makers are about to cut production by 20–30% this year, because of a number of factors, also including the unsuccessful, redirection of supplies to China, which is not a very welcoming market at the moment because there is an excess of supply of ferrous metals. But the key factor contributing to losses of steel makers is strengthening of the ruble. It hurts exporters. Domestic consumer purchasing power is significantly down, and it's not recovering. Unlike some other figures that is frequently quoted, consumer purchasing power, retail sales have fell to about 10% since the beginning of the war, and it's not recovering. It's flat. It's like reverse L shape. So there are many effects. Well, I can talk for hours about that. There's a lot to come. So sanctions are having a profound long-term effect. There is no other economic model to substitute what we had, because we have been importing capital to sustain our economic growth when the growth was still around. Since 2014, it's no longer available. We can't borrow significantly from international financial markets. We continue to import technology. Now it's essentially down to whatever we can find in China. Whether China is interested in our market, that is a big open question, because Russia is an economy with an extreme amount of risk, which is in decline. There is no positive prospect whatsoever to invest, grow, establish presence, and invest in Russian projects beyond just importing oil and gas and basic resources. So China, Putin had announced this big pivot to China already 8 years ago. It was not working terribly successfully. My assessment, I also published a big paper about that for Wilfred Martin Center in Brussels last year. I did a cross-check of what worked and what didn't from the big portfolio of joint projects announced by Russia and China in May 2014 or subsequent months. About 80% have not worked. Only a handful of projects really yielded results.
And yet on China, just to say that, indeed, and including in the energy sector, that expectation in 2014 that the Chinese are going to be either invited to take more part in projects, or that they would invest, the famous power of Siberia, right, investment. The expectation at first by the government was that the Chinese are going to cover the cost, and the Chinese didn't want to cover the cost. the expectation was that China was going to maybe keep buying, but then the Chinese, of course, in this advantageous position of buying at the discount. At the same time, in parallel, what we are observing is that the number of military exercises with China are actually picking up pace. We have looked at this and we saw that in 1 year before the war, there were 24 total meetings between Russian and Chinese military command. So which means pretty much a frequency of almost once every 2 weeks. And even now, as we're speaking, there is a major military exercise in the Pacific going on between Russia and China to show whatever they want to show. And so that's kind of also the unknown there, right? That maybe what everybody expected, the economic didn't work, but however, there is a rapprochement through other means. But of course, I'm not going to push on the military. It's just throwing that in.
Okay, let's look into that. China is still a very limited buyer of Russian military hardware. Despite all the rosy hopes of Putin and Rosaboronexport, they are lagging seriously behind India, Algeria, and so on. So there was a large hope that, and that's important because also, if we talk about further sanctions, many people have been like wrongly assuming that oil and gas money directly go to finance the war. That is not the case. Indirectly, yes, but it's a complicated route. But one thing which directly contributes to financing the war are proceedings from export of military hardware. This goes directly to factories. So this contributes to sustaining them. Otherwise, they will be in deep financial trouble. So one of the best advice on how to enhance sanctions is make sure that Russian arms exports are cut off completely. And there's been some progress recently with the termination of contracts with Philippines, with India. More needs to be done, but China does not contribute greatly to that component. Well, exercises, yes. If you read, for instance, about last year's exercises in western part of China, what you see is that Russian officers and soldiers have been integrated into People's Liberation Army units under PLA command. Which means that, like a general picture of Russian-Chinese cooperation, it's not a cooperation of equal partners. Right? There's always a boss in the room. So you refer to military exercise. If you really look at how they are conducted, it's not an equal intercommunication between Russian and Chinese armies to attack some external enemy. It's just Russians integrating into Chinese army units. So pretty much the same as everything else. There's been very little equity investment and very little financing provided by Chinese companies and banks to Russians, except the cases when they need to finance export of their own goods and services. It's like 99% of the money given by Chinese to Russians were related to procurement of Chinese goods and services. So then again, this hope that, like, somebody, China, India, would just simply rush to save us for some reason, it's just rosy hope. It's just not working. They're extremely pragmatic. You can even look at how they're behaving right now when Russia has difficulties selling its oil and gas to international markets. They press us for more discounts. They say, okay, we're ready to buy more oil, but with a 30% discount. Mm-hmm. So that's the totally different model that we enjoyed for years with Europe. So to sum up, sanctions are working. The effect is profound and will be felt long-term and will be nothing short of devastating. Both for the economy and for consumer domestic purchasing power, people's incomes, and so on. But we need to look at this in a lot of detail, and we need not to sort of try to, put a timer to wait like, okay, another 30 minutes. If Putin did not stop the war, we need to revoke the whole thing. But listen, this has very damaging implications. Because Putin, Patrushev, and all these crazy people, they listen to that stuff. And when they hear that a lot of people in the West have this, wrong,
looking at the clock,
wrong positioning, setting of a wrong objective, wrong goal, they push on this button, and they keep also pressing all their allies right here, which are plentiful, to sort of start this choir, like, oh, listen, sanctions are not working, we need to scrap them all along. So when people are setting unrealistic goals, that really fuels Putin's self-confidence. So we need to talk calmly about the sanctions and their effects. We need to understand that, listen, with this brutal aggression, what else could we do? Not introduce sanctions. Like, is it really an option after all what happened? So yes, we did introduce, there's more to be done. Do we expect a fast result? No, but we expect a sure result, and things are moving that way. And now I'm glad to help, provide a comprehensive analysis on how this really having an impact on Russian economy and society. So we'll be happy to contribute to a serious discussion about that.
To follow up on this, I'm going to throw in several things there. So first, you mentioned the steel sector, which is a very good example. Of course, Russia being a major exporter of steel, and the export sanctions hurting the sector very well. So one of my acquaintances has told me recently that from their exchanges with the managers of big steel companies in Russia, these directors are told by the government. The directors call the government and tell them, look, what you're doing is damaging a lot of the business, and how are we supposed to pay the salaries? And the response that they're getting is not only you pay the salaries, but you talk to your people, encourage them to join the army while keeping them on your salary on the roster and doubling their salaries for joining the army. This is one thing. Now, we, of course, are well aware of the whole mobilization effort in prisons. I think thanks to Asechkin and Olga Romanova and other Russian activists, this has become very well known. But apparently in the industry also, there is something that is going on. Second is that given this, and given what the numbers you've given of this kind of passive unemployment, I don't know how to characterize this, the unemployment which is not full unemployment, but which is de facto unemployment, growing. How long do you think the people can take this? Either how long the people can take this, or how long can the companies keep paying while they don't receive the cash? And thus, bringing to your point, which you were saying, what are the consequences for the Russian society? And there I'm going to throw a second thing here. When talking of the consequences of the Russian side, of course, we're all expecting, holding our breath when you say, oh my God, there's going to be a revolution. But what we are hearing from people who come from Russia right now, or who are keeping in touch with their Russian colleagues, and we are talking not about workers and peasants, but we're talking about people who have university degrees, who have been not Putin supporters, who have been against the war who were against the war in February, March, and April, who are today increasingly becoming pro-government. That's another thing that we're hearing. Just maybe what we're hearing is completely false. But given these two things, how does all of this actually work on a societal level? What does it bring toward?
First, in terms of impact of sanctions and all this environment on the enterprises, listen, there's a law of physics. You cannot, you hear a lot of babble, like patriotism, mobilization and all that stuff. But if you, as an enterprise, do not receive enough money to pay salaries, to pay to your suppliers, to pay for servicing of bank loans and so on, you go bankrupt. If you don't receive enough money to pay all this bills and liabilities, you go bankrupt. Which means that this is why even Putin is openly speaking about the risk of this de facto hidden unemployment spilling over into a real unemployment. Because enterprise, you can sort of bash on their heads about patriotism for ages. But they will have to pay all the bills at some moment, right? If they can't, then they go bankrupt. That's the law of physics. Second, generally, I think with all this pseudo-patriotic mobilization, there's been megatons and megabytes of various analysis about Russia in the previous years, which was focused on one point, and it was a just assessment. That Putin has created a society which is built on cynicism. Cynicism as a core, like complete ignorance of the needs and interests on the others, just completely focusing on their own selfish interest. Now, how does that immediately transform into a sacrifice I don't know. I think this idea doesn't hold water. And you can even see that, yeah, you see a lot of these videos speaking about patriotic mobilization and so on. But as a matter of fact, you know, if you really take a look, why people are going to join the army and join the front lines? Money, because they are offered. Like if you live in some remote province where average salary is 25,000 rubles, and you see a poster which says you can earn over 300,000 a month, you go crazy. And there is no job in your region which is paid that high. Not even a single, maybe, I don't know, governor or some regional oligarch, 2 people, right? 3 people maybe, but that's it. So you haven't even seen a person in your life who receives 300,000 rubles. And you see that poster and it can be you. So 99.9% of recruits do it for the money. The other thing is that there is reporting that there's a great arrears in payment towards those who are mobilized. I think when Ukraine begins shelling them with all this NATO weaponry, they will run. They will run for their life like they did in the Kharkiv region recently, just abandoning all their vehicles and all that stuff. So there's all this talk about patriotism. It's very nice to hear after all these years, but no, sorry, Mr. Putin, this is just not going to work. And what you mentioned about enterprises and their management being distracted by these mobilization efforts, this even more distracts them from survivability of their economic enterprise. So this not a positive factor which can contribute to economic survival. No, it's another negative factor. You have sanctions pressure, you have ruble pressure, you have pressure from collapsing demand, collapsing imports, and then you have this FSB knocking on your door saying, but we need more recruits from your enterprise, but we need to supply more of free stuff. We need more taxes from you. Well, do you really think that this construction will endure for very long? And listen, this, you said question of when. We don't know. Like imagine myself like running through the jungle in Amazon and I confront a big anaconda which tries to strangle me. So I try to strangle her back. When will I be successful and the anaconda will die? I don't know. I just need to get a grip and keep it going. I'm not asking myself a question in this regard, how long will this last? If it lasts another 30 minutes, then I probably let her go. No, I won't. I need to continue doing this thing. Consider this as an approach to sanctions. I think what drives Putin at the moment, what gives him optimism, one of the 2 major factors is his vision of a complete resource dominance. He thinks that he has complete dominance in energy. He has unlimited manpower for the battle. He has unlimited ammo, shells, missiles, rockets, and he will be able to outlast you because of this resource dominance, primary resource dominance, very old school, old style. This is what he thinks. So in this regard, I think when we begin asking ourselves a question of when, this is something, I mean, this is just a short road to losing, because that's the game of patience. That's the game of being able to pursue long-term goals in this conflict. So again, I think that a lot of people saying that we do not believe that we should allow this to become a protracted conflict, so we need to do whatever it takes to stop it, right? This is wrong. Because it plays on Putin's part. Putin plays this as a long waiting game. So should we. We should outlast and outplay him. I'm sorry, what if I go grab a coffee? I'm listening to whoever is asking a question.
No problem. Please go ahead. Don't. So just the following, just to kind of follow up on that, what you're saying, right? I'm thinking that, of course, Putin having constructed an oppressive regime in Russia, which can now squeeze maybe any demonstration. And we're going to see that if there are ever demonstrations in Russia, mass demonstrations. But so far, from what we understand, before the war, we saw that the numbers which transpired and then I guess we don't have the real numbers, that the whole Siloviki corpus apparatus, including the National Guard, people who are there just to oppress protests, the people from the police, people from different security agencies, count up to 2 million people. So anybody who goes on the street in Russia, that's going to be very difficult for them to sustain that effort. But, and we have seen that in multiple demonstrations in Russia. Now, the opposite is in Europe. And on that, a game of holding on that game, what I want to bring us to is, of course, the upcoming winter. In March, the EU prohibited any new energy sector investment in Russia. In April, it banned coal imports from Russia, which represented about a third of total imports of the European Union of coal. In June, it limited the imports of Russian oil and petroleum products, with a lot of exceptions for Central European countries. Again, as the United Front, it's also, I think, sending a message to Russia, because, of course, a lot of the European countries, Central European countries, whose refineries are configured to process the Urals oil and not any other oil in Central Europe, in Hungary, I'm thinking in the Czech Republic, in Poland, they negotiated that leeway. And also then the European Commission, in its wisdom, then announced in May the Repower EU strategy, where ambition to lower the Russian gas imports by 75% by the end of the year, after having filled the storage units with Russian gas, and then lowering the European consumption by 15%. Now this number is down to 5, if you listen to the latest State of the Union address, down from 15 in May. And of course, all that is against the backdrop of the already starting demonstrations in several countries in the European Union. We saw a week and 2 weeks ago, and that's just in September, where it hasn't been cold yet. When it's getting colder, and those demonstrations, they were organized by the far left and far right parties so far, which are famously notorious, the parties which tend to be financed by the Kremlin in many countries in the European Union. Now, if we're looking at this waiting game, right, and we're looking at the cold of the winter, a lot of the calculations and hopes for the partner supply of oil and gas, be it from increasingly from the US, be it from maybe some new hopes like Iran and Venezuela, which didn't materialize, be it from Qatar, etc. These hopes are not really, we don't know how far they are. So far, we're having German companies, big industry, announcing that they are going to have to cut production, and they're going to maybe also have to lay off some people, or eventually in the midterm, they can also move. We also see that a lot of people are concerned about energy bills. And we see the Commission wanting to do market design reform on electricity markets, which is, when I talk to my interlocutors in Central Europe from power companies, they're saying this would send our companies into bankruptcy by New Year. So when we're looking at this in the energy kind of scenario, how do you assess the European Union being ready for the winter, and what are the options in the short term, knowing that Germany hasn't had infrastructure-wise any gas regasification terminals because they counted on Russia so much, so they are limited in the LNG import capacity. In general, LNG import capacity is much more complicated, of course, than by pipeline. And then now, therefore, Germany is reopening, dozens of coal plants, and still deciding to close nuclear power plants. Well, France is having over half of its nuclear reactors on maintenance because of unforeseen problems with safety, and where you have just had a major drought in Europe, and everything that's hydro production is also kind of been depleted. In this situation, how realistic is it? I'm going to just here. How realistic is it that European Union can actually play that waiting game?
Well, to make the long story short, I'll explain, but I think Europe will be fine on one hand, but on the other hand, you will hear a lot of noise. It will be very noisy. Oh, we're freezing. Oh, energy bills. Oh, bankrupt. Well, surprise, surprise, a continent which is heavily dependent on important energy faces problems with bankruptcy of energy companies when prices are skyrocketing. Nobody who could have ever expected that, right? But I think all these issues are manageable, but this is also Putin's best bet. Apart from this, that's the second thing that I meant, apart from his resource dominance, he believes fundamental, that is a fundamental belief, this is unchangeable. He believes that your democracy is weak. that once you freeze a little bit or is forced to pay several extra €100 for energy bills per month, you'll weep and go ask for mommy to please stop this whole nightmare and so on. And this is driven by the fact that he's been in power for too long, and he saw a lot of rotating leaders. Clinton, Bush, Obama, Trump, Biden, maybe next guy in 2024, Chirac, Sarkozy, Hollande, Macron, and so on. So they keep coming and going. There was this all-powerful Angela Merkel. Where is she now? So that sort of gives him strength. And I think when he receives the reports about the rallies in Czech Republic, in Germany, and Britain protesting the energy prices and support for Ukraine, I think he inflates that in his mind. I think that makes him happy. He thinks, oh, there it begins. It begins. The grand revolution against the Western elites that are supporting Ukraine and imposing sanctions on me. I think, judging by everything that Europe is doing, I believe that there is enough professional capacity and wisdom to address this crisis. So far, the response has been satisfactory. 2 months ago, we've been talking about there's been a great hysteria that Europe will not be able to fill gas storages, but now look at us at Bundesnetzagentur, it's like, correct me if I'm wrong, 90% of German storages is filled, and about 85% across the European Union. So we now into the second stage of weeping and crying crying our hearts out and say, oh yeah, storage problem is solved. But then if Gazprom cuts all the gas completely, that the gas and storages will only be enough until midwinter. Europe will solve this problem as well. For once, we have these discussions with Europeans for a long time. I had a big session yesterday at the International Energy Agency here with Fatih Birol and his colleagues, and they also are sort of confident that not without great trouble, but Europe will pass through all the difficulties. To begin with, there is an absolutely obscene potential in cutting energy consumption. Energy efficiency has been, so much lagging behind Europeans' energy policies. There's a lot to do in saving, reducing unnecessary energy consumption. Then you see when the war broke out in February, March, there's been a lot of talk about inability to find alternative suppliers. But then, Mario Draghi hit the road and went to African countries to talk new contracts. And what we see in the graph that Italy now imports more gas from Algeria than from Russia, I think for the first time in history. So this is, there's going to be a lot of noise, a lot of catastrophic talk, like we're going to die tomorrow from freezing in the winter. But as a matter of fact, there's going to be a lot of difficulty. It's going to be a lot of pain. But I see that relevant people are pursuing relevant plans. They will be working. There will be a lot of trouble. People really will pay a lot more. This will reduce consumer purchasing power. Inflation will be spiking and so on. Competitiveness of the economy will be undermined. But that's the price to pay to support. Well, it's not just Ukraine. It's not just about Ukraine.
Yeah, it's more, of course.
This is a fight for a democratic, rule-based global order that Putin wants to withdraw. And this, if Ukraine falls, then he would come after you. That's simple as that. So I think it's worth some sacrifice. Here, completely unlike Russian society, here is where sacrifice really works because people understand and appreciate the values. And yes, I do see a lot of people complaining about these policies. But my best guess is that public opinion in Western Europe will generally remain positive in terms of continued support of Ukraine, despite all the difficulties.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Just maybe as we are coming to the end of the hour, we want to spend the second hour really giving you the floor and having you ask questions as well. But maybe to come back to this kind of impact of sanctions on the energy sector in Russia. Who do you see has taken the place of the Western companies who left? Is it more local companies or
You also see the increasing.
That depends on which specific area you're asking, because if we talk about equity participation, it doesn't really matter.
Oh.
It doesn't. Once equity participation mattered at the initial stage when projects were in greenfield stage. They were brought about Western companies contributing technology and governance skills, management skills, and so on. Right now, when projects are at a matured stage, it doesn't really matter who sits on their board of directors. I mean, just remember how in 2006, Gazprom squeezed Shell out of control in Sakhalin.
All of the contracts were negotiated. I think only Exxon managed to stay. And
yes.
everything, everybody else.
So for matured projects, composition of the equity participation doesn't really matter. What does matter is Western technology companies living primarily in the oil sector, because you really have this matured Western Siberian field stock to work with the wells there to ensure the necessary productivity. It's more art than science. Only folks at Schlumberger, Halliburton, Baker Hughes know how to handle that. My guess is that, like, imagine all these like big four Western oil field service companies withdraw tomorrow. That will result in a decrease in productivity of Western Siberian wells by 30% in a very short while. We're going to go back to average productivity of late 90s, 7.5 tons per well per day. Now it's about within 9 to 10. Something like that is going to fall back, because they have been, with their skill and knowledge and intellect, they have been contributing to enhancing productivity of these wells at matured fields. The other issues, like I said, some critical technologies for new projects like either petrochemicals or LNG. So companies like Linde or Technip are vital in this regard.
And Technip is remaining in Russia.
Now, listen, I would be cautious about
what exactly it means.
I think they will leave.
They will leave.
My best guess is those Western companies who are still staying in Russia, again, I don't want to, it's their business.
There are about 250 Western companies staying in Russia.
My best guess is great majority of them are simply looking for ways to leave.
To close it.
Yeah, so
it's not as fast.
Yes. So they're not. I mean, they're not running around with "I'm staying in Russia" tattoo on their chest. They're just simply quietly looking for ways to leave. But it's also, I mean, you see examples of those who left early and abruptly, like Equinor, for instance. It ends up with huge losses. Your shareholders will not be happy. Oh, this is how business world works. So yeah, I'm unhappy too that some of them are staying, but to my best knowledge, most of them are looking for ways to leave.
And what you were saying is, if once they leave, Russia gets to keep their equipment, of course. That's just going to be very difficult to take it out. So everything that they've brought, they're going to have to leave there. And you were saying, even with all of that equipment, the engineers, once they are withdrawn, the Russian engineers are not going to be able to make sufficient use of it to just keep this operation running.
How does it happen? I mean, like in matured oil field, like, when the well is losing productivity very quickly. So you have like a consilium of doctors, right? Who are looking at this and saying, let's try this, right? And this guy, he comes from Eagle Ford, Texas. Like, he spent all over Oklahoma. He spent all his life there. He tried various, fracking, horizontal drilling, like whatever, right? All of this are artsy forms of, treating the wells, because oilers speak about treatment of the wells as, educating the baby, right? So, something like that. So, okay, they left the equipment. So here you have, don't know if you saw a movie Armageddon, where there was a jokingly made character of Russian astronaut Andropov at the International Space Station, who was always drunk and so that's that sort of thing. Okay, equipment left for the Russians, but do they have the skill? Do they have the knowledge? Do they have the understanding of structures of all the different parameters of this oil
And
field.
you think it's shaky, it's not gonna work?
It will work, but again, I'd say loss of productivity will about 25–30%, maybe even bigger. So that's the price. So it will work somehow, but the productivity will be lost. Western skill and knowledge and intellect is about productivity. This is something that Russians are not really good at, despite over 30 years since the beginning of the market reforms.
This is an excellent point. On that as well, how do you see, we hear that because of the excess, in the end of the day, that the Russian oil at some point has become so toxic, not only it introduced the discount at which it was bought, which we heard was 30% you mentioned, but also that a lot of people just stopped buying it. And that for oil, but then also because the Russians stopped also supplying gas to the European Union, then also for gas created excess supply inside Russia. How does it get treated? Is there a threat of, for example, some wells just being sealed? And if they're sealed, is it difficult to unseal? And how costly is it, and how, or can you do something else with them? In which case, what? I understand that the storage has been also filling up. And then also in terms of gas, when talking about natural gas, we saw this very bright fires on the border between Finland and Russia. And everybody's been wondering, what was that? Was that flaring which went crazy? Or was it just maybe an accident? And if it was flaring which went crazy, it means that indeed they don't know what to do with their gas so much that they just flare it. What do you see happening there?
The flaring, I know I have some feedback from Gazprom folks. They are absolutely shocked at these amounts of gas being flared, and speak about this as a complete barbarity.
So it was not an accident, it was flared.
It was flared, and the reason, answering your question more generally, there is no other way in a bit longer run than to shut in the wells, both in oil and in gas. But the reason why Putin is not doing that and orders instead to flare the gas is, I can only interpret this as that he hopes for a fast reopening of Nord Stream 1, because he believes that Europe will very quickly react and beg for more Russian gas. That's his vision. They will not be able to burn this gas for long because it's also very costly. I think to ship gas from Vovanenkovo to the Baltic Sea and then burn it, it would cost you maybe $40–50 per 1,000 cubic meters. It's not free of charge. So this is one more contribution. So they produce the gas, transport the gas for great distance through new expensive pipeline, and then flare it. If anybody could ever, do it, and did somebody ever do it in history? I don't know of these examples. So this is also a pretty costly exercise. But I think Putin is doing that because he wants an everyday maneuver. Like if Europe begs for more Russian gas, says, okay, we're ready to retreat, but we need your gas all along, he stops flaring it and supplies it. With the shut-in of the wells, it probably will be more difficult. You're asking a question about what happens to these wells after they've been at least temporarily shut down. I don't know. The available experience is very bad. In gas industry, such experience is largely non-existent.
Outside of shale gas in the US?
No, in the Russian oil industry, we've never done it. Never done it because most fields came on stream in mid-80s, late 80s, or later in the 90s, 2000s, and there was no need to shut down the well. So we didn't do it. This is why I think Gazprom folks are sort of shy of going in this direction because, again,
they don't know what to do.
They don't know.
That's even more delicate than enhancing production, actually.
In oil, we had this experience, which I understand was pretty negative. 2 years ago, when Putin had agreed to the OPEC Plus deal, and some of the wells and fields have been shut down, I understand from my best knowledge is that the amount of practical experience that they accumulated is pretty negative. That it's really hard then to bring the fields back on stream is extremely costly, which is why industry always, if you also recall this OPEC Plus discussions of 2020, industry was always against. Until the very last moment, until the political decision came from Putin that yes, we do shut in the wells. Rosneft, Gazpromneft, everybody else was resisting to the very last minute. Let's not do it, right? But with all these embargoes or self-imposed embargoes, there is no other way to go. They will have to shut down wells, both in oil and gas. That will be painful for the industry. Even more trouble compared to higher costs and bigger discounts of shifting supplies to Asia.
And that, of course, will have repercussions for the rest of the economy, as
Yes.
you mentioned. We're now
Less super profits, much less super profits, close to zero. This is where we're heading.
Thank you so much, Vladimir. We're going to turn to the audience, and to people who are joining us online, please write it in chat, your questions. We're going to take it from there, and we're going to start with the audience here present. Please, any questions you may have. Let's go ahead.
And did you ever study preceding cases of embargo and sanctions? Did you look into the Mexican case and what happened when the United States in the 30s was doing a complete embargo on spare parts to Mexican oil fields and so on? And Mexico was saved by Hitler. And I think it's worthwhile to look into that. Another point regarding this Stolper, which is much nearer to us, that was the fracking revolution 10 years ago. I was much in connection with the former Trade and Energy Secretary of Bill Clinton, who worked for Sciences Po, as you might have met him, Bill Ramsey.
No.
Well, he did the energy sector in Sciences Po and no, in Italy, sorry.
In Italy.
Yeah, and so at the time, Barack Obama did an embargo. Well, there is this old American embargo on crude oil and crude gas, and Obama, in order to save his re-election, continued, and there was no LNG, even though the price in the United States was completely collapsing. We paid a third of the gas price after 12 months of fracking revolution, and there was no export of this fracking surplus. Obama wanted to have this price collapsing, and so there was no export neither to Japan nor to Germany and so on. And well, Obama got his re-election, and he got the reconstruction of Detroit, because that was the main point. Detroit was completely collapsing, and you had the intervention of General Motors into Opel and so on.
What is your question?
Well, the point is, did you look into the recent sanctions or embargo policy of the United States, or did you look into this Mexican case? And I have just another point. I'm a bureaucrat, but my family tradition is business for the last 300 years. Okay. And I'm the first bureaucrat in the family.
They must be spicy.
But you see, in order to make work sanctions, you have a big vulnerability regarding bureaucrats, and politics have to put into work the sanctions, and very often they don't know the business. And how do you feel about this vulnerability?
Vladimir.
With all due respect, I don't think the Mexican example of last century is in any way relevant. We have a very, very different oil and gas industry today, as we had by then. Russia is a very, very different country than Mexico. We don't have Pemex monopoly. We have much more flexibility. We have different companies. We have outsourced service, oil field services to outsiders. This is essentially, I was dealing a lot with this basically specifically the oil fields and manufacturing enterprises in the 90s. As a matter of fact, it was specifically the introduction of oil field services by Americans, which have greatly lifted productivity of an average well in Russia since 95, after the privatization. So we're talking a totally different environment here. Yes, we did look at various experiences of sanctions, including those imposed on Russia in 2014. If you want international comparisons, I think the most relevant thing probably was a lot of economic studies about that, with the impact of international sanctions on South Africa during the apartheid era. Because this is here's one important issue, because sanctions against apartheid South Africa did not cause its economy to collapse, but it really created this feeling of isolation among many economic agents and players and consumers and so on, which they really were not happy with. And this was something that contributed to political change in South Africa. I think this is, going back to international examples, this is probably the most relevant example to modern day Russia. Again, sanctions against the oil and gas industry, this is not a panacea. This will not solve all the problems, but this can significantly complicate Putin's ability to derive profits and rents from exports of hydrocarbons. I think that's the goal. I think politicians across the Atlantic understand that pretty well. There's a lot of, I'm talking to them all the time. There's a lot of knowledge, a lot of understanding, and generally they're on the right track. They're on the right track.
But they have the spare parts. Because the next case, the most important point was the spare parts. At the moment, where the United States no longer furnish spare parts for the oil fields, that was a problem. That's how Germany came in and could replace technology spare parts.
Could anybody come in and replace?
Yeah, but Germany had its own troubles later down the road when they started a major war, finding out that they really don't have major sources of oil production except Romania. And they really have nowhere else to go to fuel their army in the first place. So there's a lot to talk about. I think we can probably return to more relevant subjects.
Yeah, to this case, I see we have one question from the chat, and that is, in the 80s, the Soviet Union was operating oil and gas industry without Western help. Do you think that this industrial capacity still exists in Russia that would allow it to continue production successfully, even after the withdrawal of Western companies?
In the 80s, Soviet oil industry was nothing short of a total catastrophe. Total catastrophe. The collapse of output from 1987 to 1994 as a result of mismanagement by Soviet rulers was 45%. Production almost halved in just 6 years. If you actually read, Igor Gaidar's book, Death of the Empire, he quotes a lot of actual communication between Soviet oil ministers Maltsov and Dinkov and the Central Committee of the Soviet Communist Party, who were essentially saying that if you do not give us more money, more investment, we're going to collapse. And we remember examples of the fields like Samatlor, which was flooded by the early injection of water into the wells to such an extent that its production had collapsed 16 times since 1981 to 1990, something like that. This was only repaired. Samatlor has actually begun to be somehow rehabilitated only with the assistance of Western oil field service companies in late 90s and early 2000s and so on. So yeah, exactly right. We're going back to the practices of the Soviet oil industry, pretty barbaric, which have essentially destroyed oil output by late 1980s. So, well, I think this time they will probably manage better because Soviet system was so terribly inefficient that nothing compares with it. But yeah, this comparison actually plays against the notion that Putin will be able to cope. 1980s have shown us that, yeah, in 70s, Soviet Union has untapped this great Western Siberian potential, but in like 10, 15 years, it was all gone and destroyed by Soviets themselves.
Please go.
Yeah, many thanks for your thoughts. It's really interesting. So we talked about, or you talked about the current winter and what's going on with the industry today. But knowing that all this complexity, engineering complexity of the oil and gas industry, and the difficulty to shut down the wells and to restart them. And if we are still there the next summer, next winter, summer 23, 24. So what are the options in technical terms?
Accelerate the green transition.
No, I mean for the deliveries of the Russian energy carriers to Europe. So if these were to be shut down completely, what will happen? All this will be burned, or?
Listen, I think Russia is gone as a major supplier of oil and gas to European market, like forever. Assume it will not return. It will not return in big volumes. Hungary may be this, island of consumption of Russian oil and gas until certain political change in Hungary also comes, but not so much more. I don't think that major reliance on Gazprom as a supplier was built on the notion that Gazprom is reliable. When I talked to Germans over decades, they said, well, but we bought gas from Soviet Union during the Cold War era, and there was a lot of standoff and differences, but the gas supplies were reliable. It was always reliable over decades. Not anymore. I don't think any trader, any top manager of an energy company in his sane mind would ever sign a contract with Gazprom knowing that it can abruptly halt deliveries tomorrow for political reasons, and you will have nowhere else to go. So, just in a few months, European oil embargo is coming into effect. I think this will have an implication that, yeah, you have been mentioning the European refineries dependent on Russian heavy sour crude. I think the ultimate longer-term result will be that there will be a significant upgrade so that there will be more flexibility added, and Russia will never return to European market ever with comparable volumes. So we gone. We disconnected as a major supplier from European oil and gas market. I don't know if you're asking about consequences for Russia. They will be profound. We'll have another 1986 moment when for a long period of time we will not have a significant source of income to sustain our economy, which was heavily reliant on hydrocarbon export revenues before.
Does Putin know this?
Yeah, he does. He does.
So
this is why the gamble on your winter. He understands that he needs to do it now. He wants more demonstrations like he saw in Czech Republic. He wants European citizens to overthrow their governments because of freezing and because of higher energy bills. This is why he's increasing pressure now.
Do the people know this?
Russian people?
Yeah.
Russian people live in an extreme propaganda, disinformation, and censorship bubble. For them to know something, I will give you a comparison. When NASA is sending rovers to the surface of Mars, there's this, I don't remember, it's 17-minute moment while the signal travels, right? So the rover landed, but NASA learns about this only sometime later. So this is when you're asking a question about how Russians will learn about all this that we are discussing right now, but much, much later.
Then the penultimate question is, once they find out, would the Russian government and the Russian people be willing to extradite Putin and his gangsters to to stand trial for war crimes.
Let's not shorten the way from point A to point B. Much is going to happen before we even consider that question.
Doesn't revolt?
Before we even find out whether there is liquid water on Mars, we need to wait for that signal. This is, so let's not shorten. Might there be liquid water on Mars? Yes, but to find out, we need to do a lot of things. So a Russian population is extremely scared. After what happened in 2021, Navalny arrested, all the opposition was either arrested or squeezed out of the country. Some of them were killed. People really think that, what can I do? If they did to Navalny and several hundreds of his most active supporters, now what can I alone do against the system? So I better stay put. That's the general perception. When there will be a great awakening, there eventually will be, like it was in the 80s. But I would refer simply to the example of the last totally controlled Soviet parliamentary elections in 1984 under Konstantin Ustinovich Chernenko, when 99.99% voted for the Communist Party, and there was not a single sign of dissent. If we were told back then, I remember my parents went voting and so on. If we were told back then, and in just 4 years' time, we will be standing out on the streets with the slogans "Down with the Communist Party," we would not even talk to that person because we would think that he's or she's crazy, right? So let's not shorten this distance. Situation needs to grow out of the current bubble and the atmosphere of total fear that exists today into the society acting more decisively. Eventually it will. I would refrain from saying when and how precisely, and I don't think this is a productive discussion at all. Speaking about extradition, I believe that when Russian people learn what actually happened, majority of them will be deeply ashamed and will be demanding retribution to the people who actually made it possible, including Putin and his inner circle.
Gabriel, thank you very much for this presentation because I'm reading a lot of things. It really makes me think. And I would like to come back to the, let's say, one of the biggest questions for Russia, which is always what to do. So right now, what to do, which they be doing. Looking at all those energy resources which are not being sold to Europe anymore. So you've been talking about flaring, you've been talking about substitution of part of those exports to Europe by turning them to China. So how much realistically and exactly, or not exactly, but realistically could we, how much of those exports could be sold to other partners? How long could it last and how impactful would it be for the federal budget? Because this is also, the main tool to sustain this federal budget, which is in the end used to pay soldiers, used to pay siloviki. And my second question is linked to what you started talking about, those insights coming from public companies, such as Gazprom, and I've been very, let's say, surprised and interested by what you said when you mentioned that there were some, let's say, worried workers, employees looking at those flaring activities or looking at the OPEC Plus agreement some years ago. So what is happening now inside those companies? What is being said and how do people feel about all this and about the changing energy market reality? Because for them, I guess, who have graduated from, engineering schools or Gimo University in public affairs, it's like the world is changing.
Putin is, starting with the last part of your question, Putin has been building a system for nearly a quarter of a century where industry players do not have any sort of creative input into decision making. The orders only come from top to bottom. As a matter of fact, since 2000, when Putin was just inaugurated, just to illustrate how this works, they have introduced an amendment to the government regulations which prohibited ministries from sending like initiative suggestions, policy suggestions to the government. Previously, before May 2000, any ministry could write, we think that the policy is flawed in some area. We suggest to correct this way or that way, and here is a draft resolution or law and so on. Now, this was forbidden and replaced with only top to bottom logic. Like there's a window, once in a while it opens, then the head of the big boss appears, says something, and the window closes again. And you figuring out what to do with it, right? So actually, this is people in the industry, they have only like a limited designated space within which they are allowed to operate. They're really very, very much pitiful for how the industry is degrading over time under Putin. But there's little they can do because they have only their designated corridor of a very specific involvement. Now, about the turn to Asia, it's very different in terms of oil and gas because in gas, it's largely impossible. It's impossible because we cannot seriously speak about building large-scale pipelines from Western Siberia to neither China and nor India. India, I think, we should as well forget it. This is not possible due to length, terrain, and so on. With China, I think a construction of a major scale pipeline from Western Siberia to China of a comparable size volume of supply to what we exported to Europe will cost hundreds of billions, $100 or $200 billion, not less. Given all because pipelines through Europe pass through a developed territory with infrastructure and so on. Eastward, you don't have nothing. This is, if you make an assumption based on the experience of construction of Power Siberia 1 from Yakutia to China, if you multiply that, that will give you this kind of cost. We just don't have that money. That's point number one. Point number two, Chinese future gas demand is very well studied. There are many studies of this, and China also tries to diversify the sources. First, the major source of satisfying domestic gas demand is indigenous gas production. China is a big gas producer with a significant potential to increase domestic gas production. Second, they have LNG. Third, from multiple suppliers. Third, they have Central Asia, on which they made a much bigger bet than on Russia because it's much easier to buy gas from there, and they also control both the fields and the pipeline, which is not the case with Russian supplies. So if you look at all that, you will see that there is not a big niche for Russian gas that exists, which is why China has been sort of reluctant to agreeing on this Power Siberia 2, this major pipeline from Western Siberia. Yet another issue is, we talked about China willing to buy Russian gas with discounts. I can tell you that given the current level of prices of gas supply that exists by the Power of Siberia route since 29, since the inception of this pipeline, we are supplying at a loss. We are not making any profit because when the pipeline was announced, it was promised that China will be buying gas under $350, $400 per 1,000 cubic meters.
Immediately renegotiated, of course, probably because
at the same time, but the oil price was different at the same time. Okay. At the same time, when Power of Siberia was built, Gazprom have written to the Russian government a lot of letters asking for tax exemptions for Power of Siberia, which were granted, in which they literally admitted that the pipeline will not generate any profits, which means that if no tax exemptions are given, it will generate losses. Under the assumed price of 350 at the very least. We're selling now at $200 at best. So we're making losses with this pipeline.
And could I just on this exactly to test another hypothesis, exactly on the same breath. I listened to a Russian energy analyst on the Echo Moscow before it was shut down. And he said a very curious thing about the sale of oil and gas to China. He said that in addition to the discount, 30%, that China is also buying actually especially if you're talking about oil actually, some of the oil is being sold for free because China gave to Russia in 2014 in December, Russia's economy was in such a state that it borrowed a lot from China and China gave money in exchange for oil and that oil is still being shipped. Is that also true?
No, I think it was happening a while ago, this big Transneft loan, but it was repaid.
Okay.
It was repaid. Some of that stuff has happened. So we sold maybe not for free, but with a huge discount to repay Chinese loan, but I think it was repaid. Yeah. But so to sum up.
The tax exemptions you said, so that they're selling it more.
Yeah, tax exemptions are an admission that they do not generate any profits. Would take $100 billion to build this pipeline. There's no demand, and the price will not be giving us any profit. So we will spend money rather than earn. So it's a no-go. Now with oil, it's different because shipments can be rerouted towards Asia, and this is actually what is happening right now. But oil industry always told me that, listen, I said, why are you not shipping more volumes to India? They say, because it's a hell of a pain in the neck. The shipment of our major routes are for exporting Russian crude are Baltic and Black Sea seaports. So it takes 2 days to deliver oil to European ports. With India, a month. Plus, you go through all these bottlenecks like Danish Straits, Gibraltar, Bosphorus, Suez, Bab el-Mandeb Strait. The problem that it generates is that there's always a big risk of bottlenecks. Often tankers have to wait for quite a long time, which is why most of the oil shipment routes try to avoid at least most of the bottlenecks. Because more delays means that you're going to pay more damage. Plus the shipment of oil, like for a month, it's a lot of freight costs. So I would say that shipment of oil to India versus Europe will at least give you extra $10 per barrel of costs. That's my rough estimate, maybe more. On the background of discounts, so let's just have a look. Okay, Brent costs $90 per barrel now. If you have a discount of $25, $30 per barrel, that gives you $60, $65 that you receive. If your cost of delivery is 30, then it means that not much is really left. That is it. So the super profits are really in the, if we consider, for instance, oil prices receding further because of the risks of global recession, that will be even less, right? So that means, yeah, oil can be rerouted to Asia in some sizable numbers, but also this is not an endless niche. It is still a limited niche. And the profits that Russia would stem from such rerouting are not significant. So from Europe, we were making a lot of money. This will not be the case with Asia, to sum it up.
To follow up on that, there's a question from Asel Tutumlu, I guess from Turkey, but please correct me if I'm wrong. Russia still holds control over oil infrastructure from Central Asia, just pretty much what we're saying, maybe to expand a bit, especially Kazakhstan. Thank you, Asel. He's from Kazakhstan. Especially Turkmenistan and Kazakhstan. What is your prediction of Russia's foreign policy in the region? What would its energy policy be? Do you expect more urgent needs for repairs of pipelines in anti-Putin moments by Central Asian governments?
Well, we saw that, as a matter of fact, Putin is very willing to use this transit leverage on Kazakhstan. Whenever some difficulties occur, there's sudden repairs of Gazprom pipeline consortium. Expect more of that. Because I think Putin is going all out in his blatant use of energy and economic tools as political blackmail. So he's unrestrained at the moment. So why not? Whenever he feels like pressuring Central Asian countries, he will do it. So this is why I understand the Kazakh government had made a lot of statements about diversification of flows and using Caspian, Trans-Caspian link to ship more oil. That's not an easy thing to do. That's not an easy thing to do because there are natural bottlenecks in terms of port and tanker capacity and so on. But eventually, I think they will, and the dependence is huge. It's like 85% maybe. Kazakhstan dependent on oil export on Russian routes. So yes, Putin does have a lot of leverage, but again, the fact that diversification is difficult and costly doesn't mean that Central Asian countries need not to go down this road. They need to, because I expect more pressure. Putin will try to actually bring Central Asian governments into the realm of supporting his international policies, into his support camp.
But so far, we haven't seen overwhelming success. Like you say, even Kazakhstan, right? Tokayev, who is, we can say, nearly 1 year ago, or maybe a bit more than 1 year ago, was just a political nobody. He was able not only to send Russia and the ODKB out of his country, but maybe with the help of China. But also now he is allowing himself to pronounce himself clearly against the war in Ukraine at public gatherings hosted in Russia. So how do you think that these governments are going to be emboldened? And then we hear about even more Chinese investment into Turkmenistan, which you mentioned. Turkmenistan is actually the key Central Asian country which supplies to China, and it was the biggest Russian competitor on the Chinese market. Now, with the new this year, maybe we'll see the parity, but Turkmenistan was unrivaled with 60 billion cubic meters of supplies of gas per year to China. Now, how do you see that? Why would they actually bend to Putin? Kazakhstan or Turkmenistan, especially all of them are under the Chinese protectorate, if we can say so. Why would they listen?
They wouldn't. They wouldn't, because it gives you no advantage to actually align with Putin on any matters, including his aggression against Ukraine. This is why Kazakhstan, a long-standing ally of Putin, is behaving like that now. So expect more outrage, expect more trouble. For Kazakhstan, which sparks more need to diversify the routes of oil exports. But at the moment, unfortunately, Kazakhstan is overly dependent on transit through Russia. And believe me, we will see very shortly Putin using this leverage again. But as a matter of fact, CPC now is operating significantly below its capacity because of unscheduled repairs,
technical issues,
stuff that we see all of a sudden. There's a need for major repairs across the board, Nord Stream 1, and, CPC, and so.
And then there is a question from Gil from Switzerland. Gil is asking, do you have any information how Russian airlines are coping with no service and parts for their planes?
Cannibalizing fleet. It's not just my guess. It's out in the open. They're admitting it. There's no other way to go except they've stolen a significant number of planes from leasing companies. So really, they do have stuff to cannibalize. But it's the only way to go. It's like, if you go to Cuba, for instance, there's a huge market of spare parts for 1957 Chevrolets. It's the most valued commodity there. So we're heading, again, we've spoken about degradation today. We're heading this way here.
On that very context of aviation, I think it's very easy for the big manufacturers to control which parts go where and in which quality. You can't take gambles on quality there. But in other sectors, do you see, you mentioned smartphones, or let's say household goods, do you see that traffic is or trade is going more through the former Soviet countries like Kazakhstan or, I don't know, Armenia, Azerbaijan, to make some of that up? Do you see that tendency?
That was, and to a large extent, is a very significant hope of the Russian authorities and businesses, that they will be able to boost parallel imports through third countries. They have admitted right now that it's not working too well. Parallel imports at the moment is just like $2.5 billion per month, which is below 10% of the initial expectation. Now, major obstacles for that. First, you got to have really a lot of free stuff available in stock. So I think what happened in the past few months with smartphones, they have like completely sucked up to dry all the stocks available in Central Asia or Turkey. So now the problem with parallel imports is that there's producer controls a lot of supply chains. So there's not a lot of goods and spare parts really available for free, uncontrolled trade. There's only a limited number. So they confronted this. The other issue is that many countries, including Central Asian countries in the first place, they are really very careful about the risk of secondary sanctions. I hear this problem about Kazakhstan in particular, because I'm talking about this to some of my fellow, acquaintances, the Russian business people who are dealing with all this trading. And what they tell me is that it's enormously difficult to deal with Kazakhstan companies and banks because they are very afraid of dealing with the Russians, because they're afraid of Americans. It is much easier, I have to say, and we have some sort of a big problem. I hear that it's much easier to deal with companies and banks from Turkey and Israel. Turkey and Israel. Israel is willingly supplying all this stuff that is restricted by the Western sanctions, offering itself as a third country. Turkey even more so. I would say Turkey is the biggest problem in this regard. They are even luring Russians, saying, come on, we want you. Please, you want to evade sanctions, here we are to help. And you need to focus on that. But Israel is also a big problem. I can even specify some of the stuff, some of the digital components which are critical, and it's very painful for Russia that sanctions have restricted their supply.
Oil infrastructure?
Sorry?
Oil infrastructure?
I'm not sure about the oil, but the digital stuff for the banks and companies, a lot of this, some servers and other hardware is being supplied through Israel now. I can come back later and specify some specific items in this regard. So I would say Central Asia is very, very cautious. But Turkey is a big opening for Putin, and he uses that advantage big time. And logistically, I have to say, it is obviously much more advantageous to do this through Turkey, because Central Asian countries, unfortunately, don't have access to open sea. So this is why you really have to go through them. You really have to go through other countries as well, where there might be difficulties and so on. Another thing is that there's been a lot of analysis in the Russian business media and Forbes and Kommersant about this. Costs of parallel imports are skyrocketing, 200–300% cost increase of parallel imports of restricted component parts and products through third countries. So that makes it economically non-viable because price is prohibitive. You can't sell it on the background of collapsed domestic demand. To ship stuff which costs like 300% more. This is just not going to work.
So it's not going to go back to the first days of when the Soviet Union collapsed. Yes. So many people were importing on a private basis from Turkey and other countries, basically in their suitcase, the first electronic devices from the West.
Listen, this is a very very big difference with what we had in the early post-Soviet days. In the early post-Soviet days, we had two different economies. First, these old Soviet zavody factories, which were pretty much down, the production was down, no salaries and so on. But when we had the other type of economy, which was, just recently freed from government regulation, this other economy, trade, services, some small manufacturing, which was not capital intensive, it thrived. It enjoyed like 30–40% annual growth in output, right? So old economy was pretty much down, which made the overall picture bleak. But new economy was thriving. So people really made a lot of new money out of creating this new sector, which means that there were two different trends in consumer demand. In one part of the old Soviet economy, it was down. But there was another section in which it was pretty much up. It's like Soviet NEP in 1920s, right? Now we don't have this other sector. Everything down means down, like everything is depressed. everything is suffering from this excessive dominance of just a handful of state monopolies. There is no other part of the economy which is thriving on the background of old Soviet economy collapsing. So that's the difference with early 90s. So no new money, no new value generated. It's only decline everywhere.
Could you come back a moment to China's role in Central Asia? You spoke about Turkmenistan, and the Chinese are looking also out to see gas and oil fields, and of course to the pipeline. Is there a real impact, and how do they look at the Russian role in Turkmenistan, for example?
Well, I think the competition between China and Russia for influence in Central Asia was the key feature of what happened in this part of the world in the past 20 years. And China has greatly outplayed us. Just to give you an idea, for instance, last year, I think the figures of gas supply from Central Asia to China was over 40 BCM. Supplies from Russia, 10 BCM. 4 times less. If you look at the existing contracts for gas supply, we have Russia committed to supply 38 BCM through power of Siberia, 38. Turkmenistan has committed 65 per year, 2 times more, right? So China's big presence there. If you look at the oil fields, for instance, you see that Russian companies have largely exited and sold their shares to Chinese. Lukoil did in the Caspian, the other projects as well. So there's been like a great replacement going on of Russian equity presence with Chinese equity presence. This is very much unwelcomed by the Moscow elite, but there is also little they can do about it because Chinese involvement always comes with some positive input. And they give generous like gas and oil purchase contracts, they build pipelines, they bring technology and so on. Russian involvement doesn't bring much other positives except projection of political influence, which is undesired. So this is why, I mean, strategically, China is greatly outplaying us. They're also building a lot of infrastructure, roads and power plants and grid and other facilities and so on. Russians don't offer that. They just want control over resources, and that is it.
To follow up on that real quick, and then Gabriel, take a question just from the chat. A more general question: what is your analysis of the recent SCO summit? So just to actually follow on the question about China and its meaning for Russian foreign policy. I'm thinking of India saying it's no time for war, and China expressing concerns. Was it a failure for Putin? And this was a question from Pierre Rondeau.
Yeah, this is an important thing to watch because in the past few months, Putin's behavior on the international stage has greatly changed. Because in the previous years, he was like sitting in his bunker like a boss, waiting for visitors to come and ask him for something. Right now, he got out. In just a few months, he went like a carpetbagger, essentially. Iran, Central Asia. It's very clear, I think it's quite visible that he's out there at all these summits and meetings asking for help. Just on a side note, we've seen this unusual development like Putin waiting for other leaders to arrive. Normally, he was late for hours and everybody waited.
And then, of course, there was this video from Turkmenistan where nobody actually met him at the plane.
Yes, right.
And he didn't even know where to go.
So actually, but this is a detail, but an important detail. But the more important thing is that he began extensively traveling to places like he wouldn't in the previous years with at least that sort of frequency, right? That means that something unusual is happening. That means he shows that he needs help. He's asking for help. And I think the clear outcome of the Shanghai Organization Summit is he didn't get much He didn't get much. There was no pledges from anybody to help him in any way, which is really a great departure from the greatness image that we saw just a few years ago.
Gabriel.
I have another question now because you've dressed for those 2 hours the hat of the energy specialist, and I would like to talk to the politician, the political specialist. So, according to you, how will Russia's internal political life evolve over the next month, and I should say over the next years? Because what are your hypotheses, and how would you like it to change? Maybe that would be the end of the question.
First, if we observe the current Russian political landscape, you will clearly see several features. First, there is no enthusiasm. There is no enthusiasm about the system, the model, the policy, whatever Putin is doing. When I lived in Moscow, I lived for 20 years in a residential neighborhood called Yasenevo, about 200,000 inhabitants. So recently, my fellow friends there with whom I'm communicating, they went and tried to count the cars, private cars bearing this Z pro-war symbol. They counted like 15, 20, 25 maybe, across a big district of 200,000 inhabitants. And that was it. While they were going around, they saw really a lot of anti-war graffiti. Walls, bus stops, everywhere and so on. There's all sides. Listen, I mean, again, there are laws of physics. We haven't seen growth of real wages in 10 years. In 10 years. We only seen decline. We are now about 15-20% poorer on average than we were in 2014 when Putin took Crimea. You can't, I mean, objectively, it becomes unbearable at some point. If you talk to people, there's this dominant feeling of like pessimism, fatigue. This is why Putin likes to talk about the past. Because he for a long time, he stopped giving any ideas about the future. He has no vision, no future model. So I think the question is, how does this general feeling of fatigue and disappointment translates into political change? It is difficult now because of the atmosphere of fear that Putin had instigated. And listen, I think, you know, comparing this to Soviet times, and I remember the times of Brezhnev and Andropov. I was a school kid already, very politically active. So I remember I watched Brezhnev's funeral live on television.
That's how active you were.
Yeah. So as a matter of fact, at that time, the repression targeted only like several hundred of Soviet dissidents. But otherwise, Soviet government was fiercely criticized across the board. At home, at work, in schools, at you know, kitchen parties and so on, and nothing happened. Like everybody was more or less free to say that people are absolutely unhappy with the Soviet government. Not now. What happens is that Russian security services and police allegedly run a database of anybody who ever participated in protest rallies, subscribed to Navalny's social media accounts, or were liking his posts. We are aware of about like 50 to 60,000 cases when police were knocking on doors of people and saying, we know you support the extremist opposition. We warn you that if you continue, you will get jail time. Dozens of thousands of households are reached by this repressive apparatus. So the atmosphere of fear is very strong. Plus, as I said, the active opposition was destroyed. Navalny jailed, others jailed or exiled. So ordinary people think that, you know, what we alone can do about this. But this does not remove all the discontent, disappointment, and fatigue. History, and again, law of physics, tells us that at one point this will break out. When the leash over the society will become a little bit weaker, when people will see that it's now possible to question the government's policies, they eventually will. This is what happened in the 80s. All of a sudden, we found out that people do not love the Communist Party as we were expected to. So same thing is going to happen here. And then, 40 years ago, there was a very big, genuine and enthusiastic support for communism. Enthusiastic support for Putinism? No. Zero. Do you see any lines for military recruitment except for the money? No. Do you see any bottom-up voluntary rallies in support of Putin's policies? No. It is all organized by the administrations and so on. So when and how this will produce a meaningful uprising, we don't know. But I also don't see it going any other way either, because we see that pretty much the country is not positive about Putin's policies. One objective criteria about that is really hard to speak about the authenticity of Russian polling data, but some of the indicators can show you the real picture. One thing which had significantly dropped since the beginning of the war is viewership and trust into state media. This is down to 25–30% max now. According to various polling data, including, I think, most reliable polling data is the one that is done by advertisers, because they do this mediology for commercial purposes, like which media is most popular, so we place ads, right? So that is much more reliable than when you ask a head-on political question, like, do you support policies of Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin? Answer right now.
Rather ask, do you watch TV?
Yeah. So actually, they ask soft questions like, which media do you trust, completely trust, prefer, and so on. Various polling data would suggest that it's down to like 25–30%. It's fallen about twice since the beginning of the war. It was about 50. It's about 30–25 now. So that means that, listen, change will happen, but this is a very scared and atomized society with, like, completely broken political self-organization. So do not expect these people to revolt immediately, but eventually they will. So what we are trying to do is making any possible contribution to make this moment happen.
Are you scared?
Personally?
Yeah.
Well, I think it would not be true if I said no, but we passed that. We don't ask ourselves this question. We continue. If the next question is, do we continue what we're doing or not? Yes, we do. And anything, they cannot scare us more. Everything has already happened. And my friend Boris Nemtsov was killed. My friend Alexei Navalny was nearly murdered by poison. My friend Vladimir Karamurza was nearly poisoned, murdered by poison twice, and now is in jail. My friend Ilya Yashin is also in jail. So Putin done so much, so many really nasty things that we just cannot. I mean, what does it mean we're scared? We need to move on.
When you and, if I remember my history correctly, in 2002, were the Deputy Minister of Energy.
Yeah.
You came up with a plan to reorganize Gazprom, and you got laughed out of the Kremlin. Did you meet with Putin about that plan? Did you ever have face-to-face with him?
We didn't meet, but I was present at the sort of meetings like that with him. So I was the author of the plan, but the plan was presented either by Kasyanov or by Gay. So I didn't speak, they spoke, but I was present. And I was present even before Gazprom on many other occasions, because in the late 90s, when Putin just arrived, I worked as a head of department in the Federal Energy Commission. So he was heavily involved with issues about Transneft, about Gazprom as well.
Was he in the room when they shut down that proposal? Your proposal?
No. What happened is that you mean on reforming Gazprom?
Yeah. That was the big deal, wasn't it? That was...
He didn't do it in the room. When we gathered in the room, he sort of listened and said, I listened to everybody. Now we gotta discuss, make decisions, and the meeting was over. What happened is several days later, there was a letter to Putin from Miller, the chairman of Gazprom, saying, this reform concept is dangerous to Russia's national security, you should ban it outright. And there was Putin's resolution saying, yeah, I agree with Mr. Miller's government, please reconsider. So he didn't do it directly. It was like a cold shower for us because the meetings went relatively well. So we didn't expect it to follow up. Yeah.
We've reached 5 p.m. and we're going to have to wind down here. Thank you so much, Vladimir, for joining us. Thank you everybody for questions, for coming and joining us on Zoom from different countries, at least Kazakhstan and Switzerland, and I know from Germany also, and from France, from Ukraine. I recognize it. See you. Thank you very much, everybody, for coming, and hopefully that those of you who can join us in live and in Paris next time. And we here with the people present, you guys heard this glasses, kind of clinging. So we're gonna just move on to having a drink. So be jealous, and looking forward to seeing you for our next meeting.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Quickly, you should.